See how this goes. Thank you, Laura and TCD Student Group, for the opportunity. I was looking for an excuse to do something like this. I'm really glad that, not that there was an emergency and they needed somebody, but then have the opportunity to come talk to you all about this. I am not the famous person among the co-authors. Jorge Castillo has recently become the president of the National Amazonian University of Miami, so I'm certain he has way other things to be doing today, but I just wanted to recognize him as a key co-author who really made this book possible. Those of you who have been preoccupied with infrastructure in the Amazon are probably most familiar with the large research literatures on things like roads and deforestation and stuff like that, and environmental governance. And in working on the Oceanica over a long period of time, every once in a while, someone would make some reference to how it used to be and why the road ran this way. And that got me interested in putting on a historian's hat to look at the deeper history. Right? And so that, several years later, is kind of the result of this little adventure. Oops, this is really sensitive. You're going to get slides in Spanish today, but I'll just keep blathering away in English. But if something's not clear, then just let me know. This is the actual dedication we put at the beginning of the book, because as the story I'm going to tell is going to make clear, a lot of people were trying to find their way through this part of the world. And it goes all the way back before the Spanish, before the Incas even, okay? And a lot of people learned some lessons the hard way about what it's like to find your way through the Western Amazon and the transition to the Andes. Right? And so we always start this presentation this way, and it's really sensitive. We're going to go here. This. Okay, wait a minute. The arrows. Okay, we're just going to have to skip around slides. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, maybe click. Okay, so if you read histories of roads, usually they focus on the engineering. And part of what we wanted to do here was complement that and look at other stuff aside from what the road surface was and what the grade of the road might be and things like that. And I see I've already jumped ahead here again. There we go. Okay, see if I can get this right. And so we took what I've come to call an integrative approach to thinking about histories of infrastructure. Okay, and so we're going to go farther back in time, as I just noted, than a lot of people do. And as a result, we look at a lot of different interest groups who tried to find their way through this corner of South America. But to understand what they were doing, you have to consult a lot of different sources. And so we start out by looking at the archaeology, and we end up reading the newspapers of the day, trying to piece together what's going on and why. So we can do this. Yeah. Okay. This may be a map you might be familiar of if you've heard of IRSA. I'm going to come back to this way later in this talk. Okay. But if you want to understand where the Interoceanic Highway came from, I'm going to argue here that you can understand it much better, and you can understand what's going on now in Peru and in this corner of the Amazon if you go back a couple hundred years, maybe even more. Because if we only looked, the lessons that were coming in the last 20 years would have been really, really kind of obvious. And there are implications here for those of you who are preoccupied with governance of infrastructure. And I'll come back to a punchline about that in a minute. So we go back to look at the archaeological literature. And there's a whole story there that was fascinating that I don't have time to tell you. But it turns out that if you look at what highland and lowland indigenous groups in the Western Amazon over in here in the transition to the Andes were up to, if you look at it the right way, look at the evidence the right way, we've had to change our understanding, especially of the Amazonian tribes. They were not isolated. They were not primitive in some sense. It turns out that they were extended trade networks that we had with the highland groups who were supposedly much more advanced. And there was a large debate in the late 20th century over who influenced who more. And the balance of that influence has shifted such that there's a lot more focus on how the Amazonian folks influenced the highland folks. But the larger point was that there was circulation going on. And if you want to look it up, the Pito were key people who were specialists in a larger trade network. The larger point is that there was circulation from the lowlands to the highlands a lot farther back than we thought. And in some sense, there was demand thus for finding one's way between these two worlds. The Incas knew about this too. You probably heard the usual stories about how various royal Incas ran hither and yon across these three parts of the way they looked at the world and building their empire around the royal roads. But eventually they started to focus on what they called Antisuyo, the fourth world, which is basically the Amazonian basin northeast of Cusco. Okay? And they were well aware that there were tribes down there, and of course they wanted to keep expanding the empire. So they sent down various large expeditions. Probably the most famous was that of Tupac Yupanqui, somewhere in the 15th century. Depending on what source you consult, he took roughly 10,000 soldiers, a whole bunch of highland draft animals, and then they found out the hard way why there weren't already highways running around down there. They wanted to subordinate the Musus, who were off, or the Mojos, depending on your source, off to the east. In the process, he went down with about 10,000. He came back with about 300. Okay, and this begins to plant another important theme that starts to run as a thread through the whole book about what you think it's going to take to open a route and what it actually takes. Of course, the Spanish come up, they arrive, they subordinate the Incans, and the Incas begin to tell stories of Gran Paititi. I don't know if anybody has heard of this. This is sort of the southern Amazon or Andean equivalent of El Dorado, a mythic city of gold on a lake somewhere out in the Amazon. If you read the sources, I swear it just sounds like the Incans are trying to get the Spanish out of Cusco and go down, because the Incans knew what was going to happen. From what we can tell, there were between 20 and 30 entradas, as the Spanish colonial records call them, and they were all basically disasters. So there's a pattern that starts to become more and more evident here for colonizers and imperial interests trying to find your way from the highlands to the lowlands. Turns out to be a much more costly proposition. I'm going to skip ahead for time purposes the 19th century, although stuff does happen between the 16th and 19th. Because with independence in Peru, you start to see a new wave of folks trying to find their way from the highlands down into the lowlands in this part of the world again. Many of them are missionaries. There's some interesting stories there. Many of them are scientists. Most of those are foreigners. They're not actually Peruvians. And people start to pay more attention to the maps. Because as it turns out, Peruvian geographers became these pretty duro critics of which river empties into which one, and therefore which way you should try and find your way down there if you're looking for various products in the lowlands. There were a lot of expeditions. Castillo Maldonado's is probably the most important one in the 1860s, because he's the one who makes the descent. They have their boats. They make it all the way down to what is now Puerto Maldonado, and on their way to Manaus, but it's on the Madero River that half of them end up drowning, including Maldonado himself. And that would have ramifications for later on for things like the Madero complex and so forth. You know, do something about this river. But they began to correct the maps, is what happens. And this happens then, well, actually, let's have this chance to jump ahead in the story. But I got to stop myself and just point to two key lessons before we go any farther. One is that whether you're the Piro, the Inca, the Spanish, missionary of your favorite choice in the 19th century, a lot of people wanted to find their way from the highlands to the lowlands. Demand for infrastructure is really durable, long-term, and shared by a lot of different groups with different interests. And the other part is the cost of trying to even find a route, much less open and maintain one, is often much higher than we would expect. This is through over several hundred years of history. Okay, that brings us then to the rubber boom. You read histories of the Amazon, there's got to be a chapter on the rubber boom. And yeah, we have to have a chapter on the rubber boom because it does change how people understand how to get from Cusco down to Puerto Maldonado. And the logic changes fundamentally because now we have an extractive boom, right? So there are commercial interests who want to find their way down. And in particular, they want to find the least cost route. Least cost in terms of time, money, lives, and so forth, okay? And so you have the rubber barons, as they were called, who were financed by commercial houses in the North Atlantic economies, which were the ones driving the demand for rubber, looking for places. By now, Peru had lost enough territory to Brazil and Bolivia that the government finally did something to send their own expeditions down, and so they created the Junta de Vías Fluviales, which is awkward to translate. It's the Waterways Management Board or something. But they had their own expeditions, and so the barons would watch where the state riverboats would go, and they began to more systematically map some of these key rivers. This map here that you see is from a 1912 presentation to the Lima Royal Geographic Society. Okay, and I don't know if it makes clear which was obviously the best route. Anybody have any guesses? Best route. Brazilians were coming in from the north. They didn't have to cross the Andes. Maybe that's the easiest way. Bolivians were coming in from the east, okay, right up the Madre de Dios River. The Peruvians perhaps had the hardest way because you had to come over the Cordillera Nevada. Anybody? Okay. The rubber barons ended up voting with which way they sent the produce out, the product. And it would turn out during the rubber boom to be this route here out of the south, which we all know and love if you've ever been to this part of the world, up the Rio Tambopata to a place called Astillero, which was the farthest navigable point on that river. And then there's this route that I've still never seen really designed in a map that would go up to a place called Santo Domingo, where there was a gold mine, up to the railhead at Tirapata. And from out there, you could head for Lima. I'm sure we've all been on this route, right? No, because it's long gone. But this was the main route out through during the rubber boom. Okay, at least based on how many tons of rubber went out. Equally, however, there's lots of stories about how many draft animals were lost, how many people died along the way. The Tambopata was referred to as an open tomb. Okay, the underlying model, though, is that it was the concessionaires, okay, the rubber barons themselves, who were given large forest tracts by the government in return for responsibilities to open and then maintain routes. So it was basically on private initiative that the funding model for opening and maintaining the route was based. Okay? But there's plenty of documents about complaints to the government, the route maintenance was inadequate, and so forth. So a couple lessons from the rubber boom, right? The private funding model was not going to be sufficient, just based on loss of product, loss of life, and this kind of thing. And so the last part of this line gets borked up a little bit, but the issue of how are you going to do this, how are you going to pay for a road emerges as really important here. And that's going to be another thread that's going to continue through this history. Okay. One of the least studied parts of Amazonian history is what happens after the rubber boom. Everybody just assumes nothing happens. And this is where Jorge and some of his sources became really important. We read the compilation of what we came to call La Biblia, which was this compilation of an obscure newspaper that was published in the 20s and 30s in Puerto Maldonado called El Madre de Dios by Carlos León Velarde, who was a prefect there. And it focused on the challenges and problems of the time. And front and center, including in this front page article here, was the question of what's going to happen to the road now that the barons are gone. There's nobody there to maintain it anymore. Right? There was real concern that the regional society would just end up being isolated and forgotten. Okay? And so if you don't have the Spanish, the headline article is called Our Enemy, the Road, or the Path. Okay, and it's actually a very poetically written, emotionally scripted description about how bad the road is and how bad things are about to get. Okay, Velarde published other documents trying to call the national government's attention to this problem. But it's also in this period when even I generally assume, gee, nothing happens. It was Velarde, the regional prefect, who began to send out expeditions to either reopen routes or to improve them. In particular, they finally concluded that the so-called Astillero route was too dangerous and it was going to be too much trouble to maintain. Do not go along the Tambopata, is what they finally concluded. And so he sent out a couple of engineers, one of which was his brother, to find a new trace. And it turns out they followed a route closer to the Inambari River where he had to cross a few creeks, but it wasn't nearly as dangerous as going along the Tambopata. And meanwhile, Cusco starts building a trace toward a place called Quince Mil, which was undergoing a modest gold boom at the time. So commercial helped again, okay? And it was that trace that would eventually become the future highway. So all these other routes that other folks had tried to take were eventually discarded. You get into the post-war period, the Peruvian state finally starts taking notice, and you finally get politicians who are going to stake their election claims on funding of roads. Fernando Belaunde is probably the most prominent character in this cast in this regard. He becomes president in 1963. By then, the trace had advanced quite a bit, and he goes and gets bank loans, especially from the U.S. Peru was strengthening its ties to the U.S. in terms of trade at the time, and he pours that money into a whole bunch of infrastructure projects, including in this relatively forgotten part of Peru. And so it's in the 1960s, as some people know pretty well, is when the future Interoceanica finally gets connected, and there's a bridge that's built over the Inambari River. If you've ever seen that, it's like this big drop-off, so you really needed a bridge there. And then you begin to see commercial traffic starting to move. Things begin to change. And so for a while, the bank loans to invest in infrastructure idea, that sort of the road-led, state-led funding model of road building worked pretty well. Is that there were several policy goals that resulted from this. People began to move down from the highlands into the lowlands. They began to settle the roadsides. They began to plant crops and establish farms. Peruvian agricultural production goes up. They don't have to import as much food. There were a whole bunch of good things that were happening for the policymakers, as long as they could pay for the loans. And so fiscal conditions change. The U.S. begins to get concerned that Peru is going to turn into an agricultural exporter like the U.S., and there were certain interests in the U.S. that didn't like that. Long story made short, Belaunde gets thrown out of office in a left-wing military coup, okay, and the party ends. And so while there were some advantages of doing the state-based route as opposed to a private sector-driven route for funding, it also had its limitations. All right, we're going to jump ahead a little farther. We're going to skip over the decade when the military is in power, because they didn't do a whole lot for roads or this one, and go to the 1980s, which is the decade when a lot of countries, including Peru, but also Brazil and some others, enter in a state of economic crisis. Okay, and we're going to go to Brazil now. Sometimes you have to understand what's going on somewhere else to grasp what's happening to a certain region. Brazil had been under military rule since the 1960s, some other Latin American countries in South America as well. But with redemocratization under the economic crisis of the 1980s, Brazilian geopolitical thought about the Amazon starts to shift fundamentally. That is to say, the strategy for where to put roads and why the state would invest in roads changes. The old strategy of let's build roads to secure territory because we're suspicious of our neighbors goes out the window. And under a condition of economic crisis, there was a shift to the so-called geoeconomic approach, where, hey, let's build roads up to the frontiers with our neighbors so we can trade with them to stimulate our economies. Okay, and so Peru under the Cardoso administration, or I'm sorry, Brazil under the Cardoso administration in particular, it was in this period in the 90s that they identified we need to get to Pacific ports because China, the Asian tigers, they were emerging at this time. They begin to really see those as potential trading routes. Of course, you got to get over the Andes, you got to go through Peru, and so guess what? We start thinking about roads across this part of the Amazon. So by the 1990s, Brazil and Peru are signing agreements. Hey, we want to build roads together, okay? There's a north route up the Amazon, there's a central route through Tingo Maria, and there's the south route, okay, which is where Velarde's engineers had gone. Okay? Alberto Fujimori thought this was a great idea. He was pursuing neoliberal policies, and the idea of expanding trade and export gelled really well with what he and his planners were thinking. And as it turned out, there were also regional economic interests, especially led by the Arequipeños, but followed closely by Puno and Cusco and even Madre, who also wanted to see a road. Okay? So there was interest at the international, the national, and at the regional level. And support tended to increasingly shift toward the southern option. But there are some complications, of course, in the 1990s, right? Setting aside the Sendero Luminoso and some of these kinds of issues that were especially strong in the South, there were also some questions about, is this even a good idea? Okay? For all the political support, people began to do viability studies, and they confirmed what's kind of obvious by now in this history, that this is going to be really expensive. Okay, and what's more, the economic benefits, the conclusion you get kind of depends on the assumptions you make. Okay, and so the issue here that had emerged almost 100 years ago begins to intensify. How are we going to pay for this? Okay, and finding a funding model becomes a really big deal. Which brings me to IRSA. Brazil had already been pursuing this kind of geoeconomic logic under Avança Brasil and some of these other infrastructure plans within the country. IRSA is basically an internationalization of Avança Brasil. It's Brazil taking the geoeconomic strategy international. And so under IRSA, Cardozo and others, the banks, construction companies called this big summit around 2000. And they call for the ministries and others to say, get together and figure out which projects you want to build, and we'll figure out a way to pour money into this. Right? And so they had a whole list, as many of you have probably heard. And then the question was, well, which projects are we going to select? Because they didn't have money to pay for it. And in our analysis, there were basically two kinds of projects that got funded. One are the projects that, as the banks demanded, would have the viability studies, and yes, this is viable, we should do this, and the banks poured their money in. Okay? So you go the private sector approach. Those projects tended to be in highly developed areas where there was already a port, and it was just a matter of upgrading the port or adding a couple of rail lines or things like that. However, there was another category of projects, including the interoceanic project, that the dirty secret was, okay, it might not be economically viable now, but maybe somewhere off in the far future it might be. And in any event, somebody who's important thinks it's strategically important. And look at that, you can get from Brazil to the Pacific coast through this corridor. So therefore, it was also funded, never mind questions about viability. Go without going 6 slides at once. There we go. So IRSA was organized around these big axes of integration. One of those was the Peru-Bolivia-Brazil axis, okay? And the biggest project in that axis was the Interoceanic. Peru goes through an important political moment in 2000. In the middle of all of this, Fujimori kind of officially sort of wins the 2000 election, but then there are accusations of fraud and a whole bunch of stuff happens. And Alejandro Toledo becomes Peru's first truly democratically elected president in roughly a decade, okay, who faced really high expectations that weren't going to be met by civil society. And so when his approval rating starts to take a nosedive by late 2002, and IRSA is coming along, and he embraces the Interoceanic Highway and a couple other major IRSA projects, because then you can show deliverables. And so here's the sign. This is the road before it got paved, and Toledo's name is all over it. So as a strong executive with the supervision of a lot of agencies, Toledo sends the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Finance, and a variety of others to get busy setting up a contracting process. They realize that there's no way one company is going to be able to build the whole thing. And so they divided into these tramos, these different numbers here, and basically said, we'll give contracts for the different pieces. Interestingly, after 500 years of waiting and trying to figure out how to get through here, the viability studies were done and approved quickly on a matter of months or even weeks. Similarly, the contracting process happened on a matter of months or weeks, okay? And it was happened through Toledo's use of some supreme decrees. I want to call attention to 3 key issues that really riled up the public. One is the Ministry of Finance observed that there wasn't a final financial evaluation required under the SNP program by law and all the rest. Toledo's administration responded by emitting another supreme decree saying the project is of national importance and we're going to proceed no matter what, basically. Okay. Similarly, there were a lot of critics inside and outside of government that said there's no definitive environmental impact assessment, so you can't by law proceed. They basically did the same thing. And finally, when the comptroller observed that one of the proponents for contracts, the Brazilian construction firm Odebrecht, still had a pending judicial process before the courts, which also by law meant Odebrecht should not have gotten a contract, they went forward anyway. And just the administrative gymnastics that made that possible are another fascinating story. And by the way, Odebrecht got 2 contracts. So after several hundred years, then really quickly, construction got underway. And construction proceeded apace. And over a few years, the Interoceanic Highway arrived, bridges and all. That's about the time when people started asking questions. Well, there's lots of money for the construction. What about money to govern the impacts? And so this is where the governance questions became of preeminent importance. And this is part of the debate that you've probably heard about the direct and the indirect and the ecological and the economic and all of these different kinds of impacts. We skate through some of that, but I'll give you a few pictures, right? So there's Wepetwe, a large alluvial gold mining area. This is what it looks like from the ground. This is an urbanized area right along the highway that you can see grew up very quickly in a matter of months, okay, in the mining economy, which was facilitated by the accessibility afforded by paving the road. Deforestation goes up. You can see that there are plantations of new crops like papaya get planted. Logging accelerates, legal, informal, and otherwise along the highway as well. Urbanization also proceeds very quickly. Okay, you can see at the top right here, this is the route of the highway through the middle of Puerto Maldonado. It had the perverse effect of actually dividing neighborhoods instead of integrating people. But you also see a lot of new urban growth, especially on the north side of the river. So lots of things change when the highway actually happens. Summarizing brutally, most of the impacts were negative, but it kind of depends on what kind of impact we're talking about, and we can take questions about that. Oh, by the way, the cost of the 3 sections that were the initial construction jumped by about 3-fold, from roughly 700 million to about 1.9 billion, depending on whose accounts you're looking at. By then, Toledo was out of office. He'd been replaced by Alan Garcia, who did various different things in response to this. Part of it was to blame Toledo. Part of it was to pick a fight with basically everybody in the press, basically saying that we should roll back regulations and let development of the region proceed. And also, by the way, he supervised the creation of the Ministry of Environment. So it's Garcia's mandate in the late 2000s is complicated. We can talk a lot about those impacts, but this is what I want to talk about. There was always questions about how fast the contracting went and why it went so fast. Okay, and we began to find out in 2015. We're going to go back to Brazil. Sorry, stay in Peru, but you're not going to understand what happens with the highway if you stay in Peru. The Brazilian public ministry and federal police opened an investigation that came to be called Lava Jato for humorous reasons. And finally revealed in 2015 that Odebrecht had this innocuously named Division of Structured Operations. And when you went in there and you looked at the accounts and your systems, it turned out that the reason that division existed was to make illegal bank payments to various political figures. Okay? And so the investigation then kicks off. It starts in Brazil, okay, but then it becomes international. In late 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice, of all agencies, publishes a series of press reports that reveals that what Odebrecht was up to was not just happening in Brazil, it was also happening in Peru, and actually about 15 other countries, to the tune of something around $800 million was their estimate of just bribes and kickbacks. Okay, and so they begin to go catch executives, starting with Marcelo Odebrecht, who is the grandson of the founder of the company, Jorge Barata, who was the CEO of Odebrecht Peru, and they begin to give testimony as to what they were up to and who they were telling their functionaries to send money to. And what happens with the case of the Interoceanica is the names of Toledo and Garcia and some others in the Peruvian context come out. So in the last several years, in the 20-teens, this is what begins to unfold. Congress, of course, gets wind of all of this. They open another investigation. There had been some earlier ones. But one I want to call particular attention to was the one that one body ended up heading. Originally, there was a commission, but one by one, politicians of major political parties stepped back. And we now know they did so because their parties were about to be implicated as well. And Patti became sort of one of our heroes in telling this story because he was just about the only one left who was willing to say what they'd found. And they refused to have a public debate about this as required by law. And so he publishes his minority report and turns it into a book. But long story made short, the illegal payments helped go a long way to explaining why there was never a financial overview, why there was never a complete environmental impact assessment, and why some of these other required steps were skipped. And after that, it's kind of a telenovela, and with multiple different lines. There's the Toledo story. He had fled to the U.S., okay? He's eventually apprehended. There's a long extradition proceeding. He is extradited. There he is getting off the plane in Callao. He's sitting in prison in Lima, waiting trial, okay? Alan Garcia is a very different kind of story. He apparently didn't take as much money, but vehemently denied everything. And when police came to apprehend him, instead of allowing himself to be taken into custody, he runs up to the second floor of his house in his office and shoots himself in the head. That was a key moment, by the way, I think, in helping us understand, among many other things, why Peru is in political crisis, because there was a lot of recrimination against the investigators. He was a member of one of the major political parties in Peru, and their supporters responded very negatively against the investigations that was going on. Okay, so here's his coffin, and you can see manifestations of support. Pablo Pedro Kuczynski, or PPK, as he's referred to, becomes president in the midst of all of this happening. Turns out he was the Minister of Finances under Toledo, so a whole bunch of questions got raised about what he was doing and where he was on August 4th, 2005. Story about that. He ends up renouncing the presidency under pressure from, among others, Garcia's and some of the other major parties. His VP, Martin Vizcarra, becomes president. Vizcarra, by 2020, is calling snap elections, dissolving Congress, and trying to fight corruption. And that makes things really, really messy. That also helps explain what happens in Peru over the last couple of years in terms of the crisis. I could go on. There's a bunch of other subplots. I know I'm running through time. A few reflections on the sort of breathless conclusion to this, that, again, demand for infrastructure is really, really strong and durable. It doesn't really ever go away. But the counterpoint to that is it's really hard to find super expensive projects, okay, whether it's public, private, or some combination. Okay? And for those of you worried about infrastructure governance, there's this other one, right? The zombie projects problem. You shoot down a project now, okay, it's probably going to get back up later. It will probably be dressed up with a different name or something, but it's often the same route. And studying infrastructure history gives us some insights about why these things come back and how they get repackaged. Along that, the impacts and the costs are much higher, but there are also many different kinds of costs. As we see in Lava Jato, it's not just about what was being debated, things like deforestation, illegal economic activity. It's also about like reputational costs and what the cost of a major corruption scandal will do to an oversight agency, to the Congress, to the president. To me, this is part, although by no means a complete explanation, of why you see such a big fight between the executive and the legislative branches in Peru right now. Who gets to decide these things? And then there's the whole planning process. If you focus on construction, you still need to pay attention to governance after construction, okay? And so kind of a bottom line here out of all of this is infrastructure governance is para siempre. You need to be doing it now. It doesn't matter if there's not a project being proposed. There's going to be one coming eventually, and you want to mobilize civil society in anticipation of that. All right, my mouth is dry. Y'all are probably tired of listening to me. I will stop there. We could talk about more of what happens. The book basically ends in 2020, and obviously there's a whole bunch of stuff that is important in Peru that has happened since then, and we're actually working on a manuscript for that. But if anybody has any questions or comments, I'll go too fast.